The spinal cord is a mass of nervous tissue about the diameter of a nickel that extends from the base of the medulla oblongata all the way to about the 12th thoracic vertebrae. Below the 12th thoracic vertebrae, we don't have a spinal cord anymore. We have individual little nervelets, and these nervelets, someone thought collectively looked like a horse's tail because they named it the cauda equina. Caudal refers to tail, equine refers to horse, so literally horse's tail. Incidentally, it is this area from which cerebral spinal fluid is withdrawn during a spinal tap. A syringe is inserted and cerebral spinal fluid is withdrawn. This region is appropriate for spinal tap because you don't have to worry about damaging the spinal cord because there is none, and the individual little nervelets will move out of the way as the syringe is inserted. Let's go back to the spinal cord proper here. Spinal cord allows for communication between different levels of the human body and also serves as an integration center for spinal nerves. Notice that there are two enlarged areas. One close to, and I guess overlapping into the cervical region, is the cervical enlargement. Why would this area of the spinal cord be enlarged? Well, it's enlarged because here is where the cell bodies of motor neurons that control the muscles of the upper limbs are located. Here in the thoracic region, but close to the lumbar region, we have the lumbar enlargement. The lumbar enlargement contains neuron cell bodies for motor neurons that control the muscles of the lower appendages. Imagine if we were to come in and remove a cross section of the spinal cord as shown with this red box. You would have a specimen that looks something like this, a nice cross section of the spinal cord complete with the extending spinal nerves. This image is found both in your lab manual and your textbook, and you're going to find it extremely helpful in identifying structures on the models of the cross section of the spinal cord. Let's talk a little bit about what you are looking at here so that this image can help you identify structures on the models. I know that you're familiar with this image here because we examined this image when we were looking at the classification of different neurons by function, or I should say functional classification of neurons, the sensory neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron. So I want to relate this image that you're already familiar with to this image that you're probably not as familiar with, but that, as I said, it will be very helpful to use when identifying structures on the cross section of the spinal cord. First, remember that a ganglion, or ganglia plural, is a mass of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. We're outside of the spinal cord, so this is the peripheral nervous system. And what we find here is a mass of cell bodies of sensory neurons. So that's what this large, sort of enlarged structure is. It's called the dorsal root ganglion because it's on the dorsal side. It's on the dorsal side. And the structure here looks like a root. So this is the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion contains the cell bodies of sensory neurons. What about this structure here, this dorsal root? It contains the sensory fibers of these sensory neurons. So sensory input enters the spinal cord through the dorsal root. In fact, if we were to anesthetize these dorsal roots or sever them, you would lose sensation from a specific portion of the body. What about the ventral roots here? Well, the ventral roots contain the motor nerve fibers. They contain nerve fibers that send motor output out to effectors, such as skeletal muscles. Again, if we were to anesthetize or sever the ventral roots, you would lose the ability to control muscles in a specific part of the body. So sensory input enters the spinal cord through the dorsal root, and motor output leaves through the ventral root. Here, the spinal nerve is formed when the sensory and the motor fibers are packaged together. Spinal nerves are what are called mixed nerves. They contain both sensory and motor fibers. What do you think would happen if we anesthetized a spinal nerve or severed a spinal nerve? You would lose both sensation as well as motor control over a specific part of the body. Let's move now to specifically the cross section of the spinal cord proper. Notice we have white matter surrounding this butterfly-shaped gray matter. Why is this area gray? Well, if we look down here at this figure again, we have some clues. What is gray matter? It's where we don't have myelinated axons. Cell bodies are not myelinated. Therefore, where we have cell bodies, we have gray matter. In this gray matter, we have the cell bodies of interneurons, the cell bodies of motor neurons, and because we have relatively short axons, we have non-myelinated axons. And that's what forms this butterfly-shaped gray matter. Cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. Now, we can be very specific in terms of a location on the gray matter, and we refer to those locations as horns. For example, this would be the posterior or dorsal horn of gray matter. This would be the anterior or ventral horn of gray matter. This would be the lateral horn of gray matter. And yes, you must use all those terms. You cannot just call it a horn of gray matter or an anterior horn. You must use the directional terminology and horn of gray matter. We refer to the white matter as columns of white matter. And similarly, we can be very specific as to where on this white matter we want to refer. This is the anterior column of white matter, posterior column of white matter, lateral column of white matter. And as with the gray matter, you must use the directional terminology along with column of white matter. A common mistake students make is they can't remember which is which with respect to the columns and the horns. Sometimes they'll refer to horns of white matter and columns of gray matter, which of course is incorrect. So what I tell students to remember is think of columns. Columns are white. They go up and down. And what you're actually looking at here with the white matter is myelinated axons relaying messages up and down the spinal cord. So remember white marble columns, and hopefully that'll prevent you from mixing the columns of white matter up with the horns of gray matter. There are three membranes that protect the spinal cord. Collectively, they are referred to as the meninges, and they are going from superficial to deep, the dura mater, which is the thickest of the three, and dura mater literally means hard or tough mother. Deep to that, we have the arachnoid. Arachnia refers to spider. Someone thought it looked like a spider's web, which is where it gets its name. And the deepest is the pia mater. And the pia mater is actually attached to the nervous tissue. I tell students to remember DAP so that they don't mix the three up. The outermost or superficial meninge is dura mater, and deep to that is the arachnoid and pia mater. So DAP as a way of remembering which one is which. If you have heard of meningitis, that is inflammation of the meninges. Spinal meningitis is specifically inflammation of the meninges surrounding the spinal cord. Itis refers to inflammation. So meningitis is inflammation of the meninges. You will be identifying structures on the cross section of the spinal cord, both images and a couple of models. And one of those models is the cross section of the spinal cord with the surrounding vertebrae as shown here. I want to relate this figure to this model, and I'm going to point out many of the structures you're going to have to identify. I'm going to start superficial and I'm going to move deep. Again, I'm going to start superficial and move deep. I'm going to start with the meninges themselves. So here's the dura mater. Where would the dura mater be on this model? It would be here. This layer here is the outermost meninge. It is the dura mater. Here, outside of the dura mater, is the epidural space. And if you've ever heard of an epidural, it's anesthesia that's delivered to a expectant mother that is in labor. They deliver that anesthesia to this area. This is filled with fat, and it simply diffuses through the fat layer of the epidural space. It's called the epidural space because it is above or upon the dura mater. So this is the epidural space. This is the dura mater. There's a layer that's very close to the dura mater here, which is called the arachnoid. And this space here is the subarachnoid space. Sub means below. This is the space that is below the arachnoid. And so it's called the subarachnoid space. And the subarachnoid space is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. So we have the epidural space, the dura mater, arachnoid, subarachnoid space, and then finally here we have the pia mater. Pia mater is attached directly to the white matter of the spinal cord. And speaking of white matter, here we have our anterior, posterior, and lateral column of white matter, and we have our anterior, posterior, and lateral horn of gray matter. And this little cavity here is called the central canal, as shown on the figure here on the left. A couple of other structures to point out. Here is the dorsal root, ventral root. This enlarged area here is the dorsal root ganglion. This is the spinal nerve. Dorsal root ganglion on the image, spinal nerve. And those are all the structures that you will have to identify on this model. This is a second model of the cross-section of the spinal cord, and unlike the previous model, it is not surrounded by a vertebrae. You will not see the dura mater or the arachnoid. There is a pia mater. If we were looking at an anterior view, you would see the pia mater attached to the white matter here, but there is no arachnoid, subarachnoid space, dura mater, or epidural space to identify on this model. All other structures are there, of course. Again, we have the anterior, posterior, lateral column of white matter, anterior, posterior, lateral column of, horn of gray matter, central canal, posterior or dorsal root, anterior root, dorsal root ganglion, and spinal nerve. We are now going to leave the spinal cord. So we're going to follow one of these roots to the spinal nerve. So we're now in the peripheral nervous system. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they emerge from the spinal cord between the vertebrae through the intervertebral foramen. If you recall, I gave you a little saying that would allow you to remember how many of each type of vertebrae there were. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We're going to use a similar method for remembering how many of each type of spinal nerves there are. There are 8 cervical nerves, or eight pairs, I should say, of cervical nerves. Why 8 when we only had 7 vertebrae? Well, we have one pair that emerges above and one below the first cervical vertebrae. So we have 8 instead of 7. So we're going to have breakfast at 8 instead of 7. We're still going to have lunch at 12. So there are 12 thoracic nerves. We're going to have dinner at 5 lumbar nerves. But we're also going to have dessert at 5 sacral nerves. And then we're going to study A&P all the way till about 1 a.m. when we're going to stop and we're going to have a midnight snack. 1 coccygeal nerve. So remember, 8, 12, 5, 5, 1. 8, 12, 5, 5, 1. If you say that about 10, 15 times, I guarantee you almost that you will remember that. 8, 12, 5, 5, 1. Why do we care about those spinal nerves? We care about those spinal nerves because those spinal nerves, when they emerge from the spinal cord, are going to immediately split into a dorsal ramus or segment and a ventral ramus. And we're going to focus on the ventral ramus, not worry about the dorsal ramus. That ventral ramus is going to extend to the anterior side of the body and form a plexus, a network of nerves. And we care about that because that network of nerves is going to give rise to peripheral nerves that extend into our limbs. Just to make sure you know where and what we're talking about, on our original figure, here is our spinal nerve cut off. So we're talking here. That spinal nerve splits into a dorsal and ventral ramus. That ventral ramus forms a network of nerves on the anterior side called a plexus. We are now looking at an anterior view of those spinal nerves and the plexuses that they have formed. There are 4 plexuses. In the cervical region, we have a cervical plexus. Extending into toward the brachial region, we have a brachial plexus. Notice, inferiorly here, we have a lumbar plexus and we have a sacral plexus. Notice that we do not have a thoracic plexus. We have individual, what are called intercostal nerves, which extend between the ribs. Costa are your ribs. The spaces between the ribs are called intercostal spaces, and the nerves in those intercostal spaces are called intercostal nerves. A word of caution: don't mix up the cervical plexus with the brachial plexus. Students do it all the time. I am not 100% sure why, because the brachial plexus is known for the fact that, or named for the fact that, it extends into the arm. The cervical plexus does not extend into the arm, so it should be relatively easy for you to distinguish between these two. I'll talk in a moment how you can distinguish between the lumbar and the sacral plexus. Let's look at two nervous system models, making sure that we don't mix up the two plexuses. So here we have the cervical plexus here in the neck, and then we have the brachial plexus extending into the arm. The difference is even more profound on this model. Here we have the cervical plexus, and you really can't miss the brachial plexus. Here we have running between the ribs, the intercostal nerves. Same thing on this model, we have the intercostal nerves. Why do we care about the plexuses? We care about the plexuses because they're going to give rise to several peripheral nerves that we're interested in. For each of these peripheral nerves, which are listed on your study guide, you must be able to identify them on an image or on a model. And you must also know from which plexus they extend. Let's look first at the brachial plexus here. Extending from the brachial plexus, we have the axillary nerve, so named because it extends from the axillary region, the armpit region. We have the median nerve. The median nerve runs right down the middle of your forearm. It's the nerve that is irritated by carpal bones in people who have carpal tunnel syndrome. Running along the radius is the radial nerve. Remember the radius when you're in correct anatomical position, it is the lateral bone. And running along the ulnar nerve, we have the ulnar nerve. These are all the nerves that extend from the brachial plexus. Extending from the lumbar plexus is the femoral nerve. The femoral nerve descends into the anterior thigh. We know we're looking at the anterior portion of the thigh because the toes are pointed at us. That's the only nerve of the lumbar plexus that you might have to identify. Extending from the sacral plexus into the posterior thigh is the sciatic nerve. How do we know we're looking at the posterior thigh? The heels are toward us, so that's how we know. Remember the greater sciatic notch? It's so named because the sciatic nerve transmits through it. That sciatic nerve then splits and changes its name to the tibial nerve, which extends along the posterior side of the tibia through the leg. Notice that all of these nerves are either named for regions of the body or nearby bones. So if you know your body regions and you know your bones, which at this point you should, it's not difficult at all to remember the names of these nerves. If you look on your study guide, you will notice that there is one other nerve that you have to know a little something about. You will not have to identify it, but I do want you to know from which plexus it extends, and I want you to know the very important muscle that it controls. That nerve is the phrenic nerve, and the phrenic nerve extends from the cervical plexus. And the very important muscle that it controls is the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is primarily responsible for your ability to inhale and, as it relaxes, exhale. This nerve is important because if it is severed, say you break your neck and the phrenic nerve is severed, you will lose the ability to contract your diaphragm. If you lose the ability to contract your diaphragm, you essentially will go into respiratory arrest, and two things will happen. Either you will die or if medical intervention is fast enough, you'll have to spend the rest of your life on a respirator. So it's very important to understand that the importance of that phrenic nerve that extends from the cervical plexus and that it controls your diaphragm. Earlier in this presentation, I mentioned that I would show you how you could distinguish the lumbar plexus from the sacral plexus. So we are looking at the lower appendages right here. Here on the right, I want you to notice this nerve that is extending into the anterior thigh. How do we know it's extending into the anterior thigh? Well, this is the coxal bone here, and notice that it is running in front of the coxal bone. This is the femoral nerve. The femoral nerve extends from the lumbar plexus. So if we track the femoral nerve back, this must be the lumbar plexus because the femoral nerve extends from the lumbar plexus. On the other side, here we also have a femoral nerve, but notice that this nerve here is extending into the posterior thigh. How do I know that? Well, this is the coxal bone again, and the coxal bone is in front of this nerve. This is the sciatic nerve. If this is the sciatic nerve, and I know that the sciatic nerve extends from the sacral plexus, then this is the sacral plexus. So this is the sacral plexus, this is the lumbar plexus.